Hi everyone. Welcome to our channel. Retired General Douglas Macgregor strongly criticizes General Hodges, labeling his statements about Russia as uninformed and deceptive. Macgregor, a former commander himself, dismisses Hodges' optimism and accuses him of being financially motivated to advocate for conflict with Russia. According to Macgregor Hodges, predictions of Ukraine reclaiming Crimea and advancing into Russia are detached from reality and driven by personal gain rather than factual analysis. A couple of years ago, every time someone discussed the conflict in Ukraine, the same group of retired generals from the UK and US, along with entrenched figures in Washington, consistently claimed that the Russians were incompetent and losing. Despite warnings of catastrophe, many senior political figures asserted that the Ukrainians were winning. However, the truth, as I saw it, was far from optimistic. If the conflict continued, I believed it would lead to destruction of Ukraine, with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dying for nothing. People were shocked because the Western media echoed the same unrealistic narrative, even after the Ukrainian prosecutor general reported 500,000 dead soldiers on January 7th. Many found it unbelievable, attributing the casualties to the Russians. I believe the casualty exchange ratio is heavily skewed against the Ukrainians, likely around 1-7. Furthermore, the Ukrainians received inadequate advice and equipment, resulting in a poorly equipped army and a country in ruins. The situation has become dire, with the Russians even capturing elderly men and teenage boys in uniform, resorting to press gangs to bolster their forces. People in western Ukraine are horrified by the situation. Despite their universal disdain for Russians, they are reluctant to be drawn into the conflict. If the truth were made public, people would see Zelensky as a complete fraud, more interested in personal gain than representing Ukraine's interests. He seems focused on selling out the country's rich farmland to entities like BlackRock and Monsanto, likely eyeing a comfortable retirement in Italy, Cyprus, Florida, or elsewhere. The speaker believes Ukrainians have been ruthlessly exploited, despite claims to the contrary. Between 450 and 500 Americans, including contractors, have died in Ukraine. The administration may not disclose this information, but it remains true. The speaker criticizes the exploitation of people for perceived benefits, arguing that Russia has emerged economically stronger while leading a move towards the gold standard, which threatens the U.S.'s position as the world's primary money printing center. Meanwhile, Russia has bolstered its military capabilities significantly, though its surface fleets lag behind. People in western Ukraine are horrified by the situation. Despite their universal disdain for Russians, they're reluctant to be drawn into the conflict. If the truth were made public, people would see Zelensky as a complete fraud, more interested in personal gain than representing Ukraine's interests. He seems focused on selling out the country's rich farmland to entities like BlackRock and Monsanto, likely eyeing a comfortable retirement in Italy, Cyprus, Florida, or elsewhere. The speaker believes Ukrainians have been ruthlessly exploited despite claims to the contrary. Between 450 and 500 Americans, including contractors, have died in Ukraine. The administration may not disclose this information, but it remains true. The speaker criticizes the exploitation of people for perceived benefits, arguing that Russia has emerged economically stronger while leading a move towards the gold standard, which threatens the US's position as the world's primary money printing center. Meanwhile, Russia has bolstered its military capabilities significantly, though its surface fleets lag behind. Well, initially I was delighted when that report came through because I thought, thank God this is going to end. I was surprised, and rightly so, that Zelensky, who's probably one of the most criminal characters that's ever risen to power in Europe, perhaps the most criminal in many respects and corrupt. But, having said that, it didn't turn out to be the case. As you point out, it simply is turning into another pass the hat around and throw money in it for what he calls reparations. Reparations being, we're going to rebuild Ukraine. It's back to the same scam I was describing earlier that involves BlackRock, Larry Fink, and the rest of these characters. That's very tragic, but I'm sure the Senate is delighted. And I know Mitch McConnell is because he's got his hands in all of that, and he's undoubtedly going to profit as well as most of his colleagues. So I guess the whole thing is a scam now or Switzerland's in trouble. Stephen and Americans are not aware of this because the Swiss decided to cast their lot for the first time in centuries with the crazy U and with NATO, effectively because what they've said is, oh, Russians are evil, Russians are bad. Let's all support Zelensky. So Switzerland is no longer taken seriously as a neutral state, which is a terrible, terrible loss of the world, because Switzerland is a place where everyone who hated each other could come and sort out differences, because Switzerland was genuinely neutral. It is not anymore. So even if they invited the Russians at this point, I don't think the Russians would show same tragedy of losing Finland as a neutral state in Sweden. Those were places where warring parties could meet and sort things out. They are no longer so. I think the Russians would probably balk at that notion anyway. And frankly, why should they bother paying any attention to Zelensky or us? They've won the war. There is a will. They're still fighting. Well, if you're sending 70-year-olds and 15-year-olds into action, pregnant women, I'm told I've even shown up out there. Are you winning? I don't think so. And the Russians are gradually advancing all across the front. I think they're going to continue to advance. And then at some point, when they decide to do so, they will go right to the upper river. Then the question they've got to ask is, how much further do we go? And they don't want to go much further, to be frank, because the last thing that the people in Moscow want to do is rule Ukrainians. Why would they want to do that? Oh, they don't want to rule anybody who's not a Russian. That's a lot of trouble. They went through that after the Second World War. The Warsaw Pact was not some sort of great boon for the Soviets. That became one shortly after the war. While they could exploit it and strip it of resources and technology, particularly the eastern parts of Germany that now reside in Poland and what was formerly East Germany. But they couldn't do it for very long, and eventually it became a burden. Cuba is another example. Cuba was a huge money pit, just a drain on the Soviet economy, as frankly, so is Puerto Rico to us. I don't know why anybody opposes independence for Puerto Rico. I think they should have it and go away. But we're stupid and we continue to hold on to these places. And the Russians finally figured out this is a waste and got out. And that was the right thing to do. They're not going to go back and repeat that. They really want to do business with the West, and they're nicely positioned to do business because they're going to be the sort of middleman or one of the key middlemen in Central Asia between China and the West. So why would they want a war? The Chinese don't want a war because war is bad for business. I know everybody finds that hard to believe in America, but truthfully, war is not good for business. It destroys your standard of living. It destroys your currency. We can go on and on and on. So I hope that at some point people will figure out what Zelensky is all about, and then we can put this to bed, but it's not going to happen quickly. Well, first of all, there's nothing hypothetical about it. It's a sham. It's an attempt to try and justify what's been going on in Ukraine and keep it going. On the assumption that people will look at this map, which is absurd, and they begin to fear the imminent arrival of the Russians, which they're not coming. And somehow or another, this will keep people like Schultz and Macron and others globalists in power. And when you have nothing left, what do? Because right now, Schultz is about as popular as the plague in Germany. And the problem is that the Germans haven't been able to figure out who they're going to put in there to replace it. There are there may be in the alternative field, Deutschland the first day. There may be some stars in that group. You have the old communist fund. Stach. She's a very, very intelligent and persuasive woman. But there's nobody there that you can point to the way you could have said 30 or 40 years ago, while there's Helmut Schmidt. He's a future chancellor, or Helmut Kohl. He's a future, and there's nobody that you can point to right now with certainty. So the Germans are sort of like a beached whale that is slowly dying. It's gotten into shallow water. It's the industrialized itself. It's basically destroying itself, and it's infested with foreigners that have come into the country that the Germans don't want any more than the Scandinavians do. So the globalists have successfully destroyed Europe. Some people think it's dead forever. I don't agree with that. But it's going to be tough to cure it. But that's the problem. So you hold out these ridiculous things and say, oh, the Russians are coming. So see, you don't have any choice. You have to do what we say. If you look at that map and I have,